this morning. And before I start I want to, I guess, acknowledge or say that these are tough times right now, and I hope you're all doing well in the midst of concerns around health or jobs or finances or wherever, whatever circumstances you're facing right now. It's a very strange time, and sometimes it's hard to focus on work when thinking of all of these issues or home. And so I'm glad to see you came today, and hope it can be an informative distraction from your day, and that maybe a little less entertaining than Netflix. So I'm glad you joined me for that. So that's good. Just before I start too, I think maybe there's a couple people with their mics unmuted yet. So if I could just ask each to look at your screen and ensure the little mic symbol has a slash. That would be okay. Very much.
But you've got a spreadsheet to track it now.
Maybe I'll just say if you could check one more time, and then I'll carry on. I think there's someone.
Okay, John, I just muted everybody. Go ahead and you can restart your mic.
Oh, great. Great. Thank you. That's perfect. All right. Well, thank you for, as I said, thank you for coming this morning. And I want to start with just a couple of disclaimers as we're moving on in the theme for the PHJV's webinar series on grasslands. The first is that this research and this work was prepared for the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture last year. However, the views and opinions expressed are not necessarily those of the PHJV. So I am speaking as an independent researcher here, and this work was done prior to my involvement as policy coordinator. I just want to assure you all of that. I hold a few hats. I work for the University of Alberta and have a small consulting company, and then also do this policy coordinating. And so I want to also acknowledge at the outset, which is a little different, but I want to thank those that reviewed this work last year: Pete Joyce, Shane Gaber, Robin Bloom, Marion Weber, Karen Rabin, and Greg Hale. I have historically, as a natural resource economist, I have worked primarily around water and wetlands, but not as much in the grassland field. So I appreciated this sort of local knowledge from those that are more versed in it than myself at that time. So thank you for that. And also note that this is currently has been submitted for review for academic publication. All right, this morning I'm going to go through 8 points and just want to give you a short overview of that now. We'll go through a bit of a purpose of what we were intending to do with this work, provide some context in terms of grassland inventories, legislative and policy drivers in the Canadian prairies, give a short overview on some of the economics literature on grassland conservation. And then I'm going to, sort of the meat of it will be around the comparative analysis, and then some discussion of stakeholder incentives, make some concluding points, and pose some ideas for next steps. So the purpose of this research was funded by the PHJV. It was to explore ways to engage in grassland conservation, recognizing that the PHJV has historically maybe been more focused on wetland ecosystems. We want to respect that there is a lot of expertise out there from other grassland or prairie-focused organizations, and we want to acknowledge that and know that this work is done to complement, and we want to engage with those organizations as we all move forward towards I believe, a common mission of mitigating grassland loss. In some ways, it's a state of the knowledge to sort of get an understanding, some background information of where we're at and where we could go. And it also, if any of you have read or familiar with some of the other publications or presentations I've done on, I've used an approach, the return on investment approach, which I feel has been useful. And as I published quite a bit with that approach, I wanted to have something that would allow for some comparison. So some of those variants on the techniques, but similarities in the methods will be here. Okay, so in terms of grassland loss, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we heard last month, for those of you that were able to participate in this webinar series, from Dr. Ed Bork from the University of Alberta. And he gave a good overview of what was happening in terms of grassland loss in Canada in general. And that was, yeah, and you can see that presentation on YouTube. But I want to just emphasize, I'd really like this visualization from Gage et al. In 2016 of the plow print across the Great Plains and the Prairie provinces. The white is the plow print, as you can see, and the light green would in general be some of the grassland habitats. And I think what just hits home really clearly with that picture is that we've seen a lot of conversion for various reasons, but this is, and I won't comment on those now, but this is what we're facing in terms of grasslands in Canada. And we know from multiple sources that they are one of the most threatened, if not the most threatened ecosystem on the planet. Now Watmo et al. In 2017, through this map of the PHJV, show and do some analysis showing that conversion is occurring even today at approximately 0.23% annually across this region. So it's not like this is something that has been done in the past only. This is something that we're facing every day. An example of this, without going into each of the provinces, but I appreciate this work from Piwar and Swadsky out of the University of Regina last year. I really, I think this is a good visualization. You can see that the red dots are grassland loss between 1990 and 2015 of approximately 13,500 square kilometers. Now there has been some new grassland came in, and about 5,500, which is noted a little more in some of the parkland regions. And in general, sort of a summary point is that we've seen, this is an ongoing issue. About 20% of historical wetland, grasslands, pardon me, are remaining in Saskatchewan in 2001. And that is more recently being updated. In Alberta, about 14% of the province and 80% have been converted to crop agriculture. It's according to the government website. And Manitoba, again, if you distinguish between the tall grass and the mixed grasslands, lost most of the tall grass, but there is about 70% of historical area remaining as of 2010 in Manitoba. Now, I think it's as well want to note that there is the difficulty, I'll touch on a little later, in distinguishing between tame and native grasslands. So some of these maps are just aggregating those. But also, one of the, why does this matter in some ways? We'll move into that. But this is a map from Fetty et al. In 2018. And we heard a little more from Barry Robinson from Environment and Climate Change Canada a couple months ago in this webinar series on the priority habitat for grassland birds and what that means, an overlaying map. So we've done a fair bit of work on wetland, on waterfowl, but this is some really good work coming through and shows the value for species on some of these grassland habitats. So that's kind of what we're interested in, and we're seeing a lot of loss. Now, in terms of legislative and policy drivers, this could be an entire presentation in and of itself. So I'm just going to make a few highlights here. I spent quite a bit of time poring through government documents on acts and legislation, and from the three provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, as well as the federal government. And I do have, so if you're interested, please contact me. I can share some of those summaries. But after a thorough review, you could, and I'd love to hear more from those of you that work more directly in this area, but there's no explicit grassland policy that exists federally or within the provincial jurisdictions. Of course, there is mention of grasslands, and we think that the Species at Risk Act and others that sort of identify the importance of grasslands for other things, but there's no, if you think of our wetland policies that now exist in some of the provinces, there's nothing comparable at the moment to those. Another sort of theme that arose, and won't be any surprise, but the differing goals and drivers from the agricultural ministries, the environmental ministries, and then energy. So those policies often have very different and competing impacts on grasslands. And without wanting to critique the agricultural sector, just there has been historically a lot of grassland loss due to the emphasis on production of food. And I think I can speak on that as well as a farmer myself. I'm from a farming family, and it's very easy to plow up some grassland and then plant it into, especially oats or canola, and get some more income from that. You don't have to worry, you don't have to brush trees, for example. So this has been an easy and historical basis for a lot of settlement in Prairie Canada. Now we're seeing a bit of a shift, I would argue, in some of the policy development through the beneficial management practices for some of the growing forward initiatives and the Canadian agricultural policy. Now there are things that are there that can be used and accessed for the agricultural sector to benefit and protect grasslands, but they are, they're maybe not as explicit, I would say. Now, you might wonder why I'm bringing in energy on this as well. This was identified as something of interest, was the impact of solar and wind energy options, especially on the grasslands in the south of Alberta and in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But Alberta, until recently, have had quite a boom in that. And I think there has been, from the literature I was exploring, maybe less attention to some of those grassland landscapes, though that's caveated by there are some requirements in place, many requirements, but I think they're arguing for some of the benefits from renewable energies, which is true. So trade-offs are seen here. I also want to note, in terms of legislation and policy, the real excellent role that non-governmental initiatives and NGOs have played in this conservation. I think of, and of course there are government representation on some of these boards, but I think of the work of the Prairie Conservation Forum, NCC, Canada, Ducks Unlimited, and others that have, there's been a lot of work done, and I want to acknowledge that. But one of the ongoing challenges I think that we often face when it comes to sort of public or oversight or social decisions is that is private property rights, or property rights in general. And that public and private lands often require different approaches for conservation. So this map, it's a little bit dated, but I wanted to put it in here. It shows some of the protected, these are protected areas in Prairie, Canada, or in the PHJV area in 2014, I believe it is. And those will have changed a little bit now. But the general sense is this, is that in this area, there are protected areas, but there's so much private property, sort of the white zone of Alberta, and that it's difficult. You have to really manage human and not manage humans, but engage and work with the stakeholders on the land that are much more, if you have private property owners and farmers and urban municipalities, this is where that is happening. And it's much more challenging here than it is, say, in the boreal zones or further north. Different challenges, but I would say the private property engagement is much more complex. And so you have sort of, and we did hear some of this from about 2 months ago from one of the presentations, but just looking at some of the options you have on those landscapes. So you do have the non-voluntary approaches of parks and protected areas. You see the role of what Grasslands National Park and how that was created, and then you have zoning and approvals and cross-compliance. Then you have a whole raft of market-based instruments that are more voluntary, that producers or private landowners or even community groups. I think there's a lot of, especially in this region too, you have a lot of community pastures or more collective cooperatives. There's a lot of programs out there that can be kind of confusing to the average, or your general landowner, on subsidies or taxes or incentive programs they can access. There's just a lot of options out there, but these are the tools in our toolbox that if you are a policymaker or conservation organization that you can access. But it's hard to know, it's hard to implement sometimes, and it really depends on the actual perspectives of the landowners themselves. Of course, then we have the extension of technology, research and development, and community-based action options that can be followed for grassland conservation, or not to do anything. And that's important to note. That these, in some cases, there is a stewardship ethic that in some cases maybe the private landowners can do arguably a better job in some areas with local knowledge on the grasslands on that particular area. So that was sort of an overview of the policy and legislative drivers and some options that are available for decision makers. Now, as we're moving to the next step into the economics of grasslands, I think sometimes we hear a lot of, it's like ecosystem services will solve this problem of grassland loss or wetland loss or forest loss. And I think they are really important to consider. And I think they are real amazing. The shift to include ecosystem services in decision making has been, I think, very important and very good. But often it falls short. I would say that you hear a great presentation and say, oh yeah, and this is how we need to, this is the path we need to go, ecosystem services. But then how do you evaluate those ecosystem services? There's the biophysical estimations, and then it's just good economic approaches that are quite challenging. And I think as I go through and went through the Canadian literature on the ES values of grasslands globally or even within Canada, I did some comparisons on just published literature, and relatively speaking, grasslands are much lower than wetlands or even forest resources. And so there's less literature to dive into. And so I think that's partly due to the fact of these inventory challenges between tame and native. And we see across the 3 provinces in Canada, we have different approaches to try to figure that out. And I know there's probably some of you on the call today that are involved in that work. And I think that's important. And it's something that as an economist, I really rely upon. And so I really appreciate that and hope there can be more of it. Another observation I have, and again, I'll just note, you can feel free to email me separately and I can share my literature review on this. But economic studies on grasslands, I would say, tend to focus on the benefits of one industry. So we can see some work, what is the contribution of, say, the beef sector or grass-fed beef to local industry. And those are really good, but I think, and important, but also maybe miss out on some of the trade-offs that occur and why other people choose to convert grasslands. They also emphasize biodiversity and carbon sequestration as primary benefits, and then sort of acknowledge the food production benefits. So this is kind of the other side of the coin, is that you can also get some really great studies that sort of set you up and measure the biodiversity or of species or how much carbon is being measured. And these are great studies as well. But then they don't focus as much on some of the food production benefits or the opportunity costs that are found or delivered by these landscapes. And so I would say that there's sort of this in the literature, a lot more of the emphasis of benefits over the costs. And this is defensible, I would say, in some ways. One, they're all doing good science, and it helps build the literature and what's happening. and increase our knowledge of these important landscapes. But I'd say maybe the disservice from my disciplinary background is that then some of the costs are, I won't say ignored, they're mentioned, but they aren't incorporated into some of the equations. And recognizing the constraints that farmers, beef producers, grain producers are facing, and why they convert. So that led to this comparative analysis. So I looked at 4 different industries or sectors, the grain producers up on the left, and then beef, and explored some of the solar and wind energy sectors and sort of did some trade-offs on the decisions that these landowners that have grasslands are facing. This is, if I was speaking to a economics group, I would emphasize this a little more, but this is these are the calculations that were used to base upon the results that are coming next. So this is just looking at over time, some of the Brownian motion on and change on using discount rates and different land use choices to compare and contrast the financial decisions that landowners are making. I know I always laugh when I show friends or neighbors this, that our farmers are like, oh yeah, is that what I'm doing? Huh, I don't know about that, but I think it works. As an economist, we love to model things. So maybe a little more intuitive is that lower equation is on that return on investment or social return on investment on land use. And as you can see on the top are the benefits of the equation, and the bottom are the costs. I think one of the advantages of this approach is that even using secondary data from Statistics Canada or the government ministries, you can put in and pick and choose the variables that you want to focus on. So say if we want to look at simply the carbon benefits, you can just isolate that and forget about the nutrients or biodiversity values. Similarly, on the cost side, we can use rent for the land use or compare the yields and profits from each year. And you can take in or out restoration. So you have retention of grasslands or restoration. So to me, this is kind of I think this is useful, and it's a little more complex than some of the others I've done, published on this matter, as I want to sort of keep refining that. But, and just to note that some of the cost estimates that were used in these equations coming up are based upon Statistics Canada, as well as some of the information from the provincial governments between 2016 and 2018. So we can have some cross-provincial comparisons and then decisions between 4 of the major crops that would be chosen by producers. Now, the benefits side is based upon, for this study, is primarily on benefit transfers. So other studies that have looked at what carbon sequestration is worth in a similar area. Biodiversity is nutrients and then recreation values. For the intent of this presentation, and like I say, I can target an individual service and provide more information on it, but I made the assumption, which of course is major, that there are markets or payments for these services. Now, this is not always true. In fact, in many cases, it is not true. It's a missing market. And so I think some of these results you'll see in the next slides are, they are the social return on investment, but then there remains a gap in terms of the mechanism to pay for those. So just keep that in mind when you look at this particular graph. So I divided it into 4 models for land use. So this is just agricultural land rental for crop production on the first model. And then I zeroed in on wheat production, canola, or beef. And beef as in the decision for tame pasture or tame hay. Or native pasture or tame hay. And what you can see in each province, again, this is using average costs or opportunity costs that you could get. So that's the next best alternative to having just plain grass or just having grasslands. You can see that in each of the so if it's a social return on investment of greater than 1, it would make sense to keep the grasslands. And if it's less than 1, it means you should convert from a sort of a purely cold, calculated financial decision making. And what's showing here is, again, think, oh my gosh, look at that. Retain them all. Grasslands are great. And they are in terms of social returns, but what I mentioned earlier is I'm including all those, including nutrient retention, carbon sequestration, biodiversity values within this, which really bumps up the benefits of these grasslands. Now, in another presentation, I have shown and can show that if you just have, if you take those out, and you face often the reality that farmers are looking at today without any payments, actually those ratios drop below 1, and so it often you should convert them. Pardon me. But I also want to, the second point is note that the magnitude of these ratios is driven by the cost. So you wonder, why is the ratio higher in Saskatchewan, for example, on some of these, and a little lower in Alberta? That's often driven by production, your yield of canola in these areas. So some of those soils are a little more rich, maybe a little more moisture. And so yields tend to be, on average, over the last 10 years, have been higher in Alberta and in Manitoba than they have in Saskatchewan. So that is where the reflection comes. Again, in beef production, it shows really high, because if you're looking at the value that you could get for tame hay production, for example, it's a bit lower than it would be, say, for canola. Now I want to look at energy conversion, and these are using, and these are, there isn't a lot of literature out there on payments for solar farms or wind farms, but I was able to get a hold of some of the Canadian wind and solar associations, some of what their payments are. So this is a little more basic, but it's just showing, they pay a lot per hectare or per acre for these areas. And again, it's not as large of tracts of land. Because they pay a lot for it, I mean, this is the decision that I think, even including all the benefits, the social benefits, it's really doesn't make a lot of financial sense to not put on a solar farm on your property if that's on offer, that's available, or an option for you. So some of the main points from this is, when you don't have the social benefits included, and as a conservationist, you often feel a bit uncomfortable saying this, but from an economics perspective, I think it still makes sense to convert. But then when you bring in those other ratios, especially say for canola production in Manitoba, some of the really good soils there, it brings it up to 4.65, but quite high for beef production in Saskatchewan. So that's sort of saying, hey, in some of those really big, vast tracts of grassland in southern Saskatchewan, I mean, beef production really is grasslands, and then that commensurate sort of value you can get from pasture-fed beef, that can make a lot of sense. I think some of those other points sort of repeat. I would say that even, one point about volatility in commodity prices, and we haven't seen it as much even this spring. Interesting that prices for inputs and the canola is trading still fairly well, but sometimes when you look at weather, and last year was such a wet year and a lot left out in the field, I mean, sometimes you can have, this can be a variable within the model that can shift to make it more sense to retain as well, grasslands. And then when I did this work, I think there was maybe a little more, I think in some of the provinces, we've seen a bit of a slowing down of some of these renewable energy initiatives and support from the provinces. And so I'd say we are seeing an expansion, and maybe we'll continue to do so, I wouldn't say that in terms of gross area, they are major drivers of loss and don't compete on a per hectare basis with agricultural use. But I think regardless of that, there's some literature out of Germany in particular that's saying that be very, very careful about where you place those. And I think we are seeing that in Prairie Canada as well, to reduce disturbance and monitoring of those environmental impacts. Now my time is just about done, so I will just quickly go through these last 5 slides. And so then this is based upon not personal interviews at this point, but some other work I've done, and then reviewing of literature on some of the human dimensions literature around behaviors and drivers for stakeholders. So I wanted to at least raise these around, say, for beef production. You look at, there are a lot of benefits from grassland retention that can actually occur simultaneously with careful grazing. And I think we're seeing a lot of those initiatives from the Alberta beef producers, the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Saskatchewan stock growers, and similar groups, that we're seeing that they are able to sort of integrate that sort of the environmental benefits, the social and the economic side for that sort of sustainability pillar to sort of maintain food production, lower carbon footprint from some of the grain alternatives, enhance soil carbon, climate change mitigation, maybe a little less on some of the nutrients and flood, but still there. And that's why some of those higher social return on investment ratios are evident. Grain production is a little more difficult to make the same argument, and I think that's something I'm really interested in engaging with right now in some other research projects, is how are grain producers responding, maybe more to wetlands, but I think looking at, in my own work, but exploring grasslands further with this will be very important, especially in the southern portions of the provinces. But you see lower social return on investments for maintaining grasslands then. Again, I'll just mention wind and energy. You can look at these slides a little later in more detail, but what we're seeing is that, again, as I mentioned, there's a fairly large payments for smaller acreage, for small areas. And I would say that, I don't know, if someone came to us and said they might want to put some solar farm or a small solar farm on a section of our land, I think we might quite seriously consider it. So again, there are trade-offs between the value of those grasslands versus climate change mitigation impacts, and also the financial returns, which can be quite useful. Quite similarly with solar. So I want to just conclude by saying there has been excellent work done across the prairies historically on grassland conservation. And I want to really give a nod to that, to those groups from the Prairie Conservation Forum and many groups. So I want to acknowledge that and say that this isn't meant to compete or critique that work. It's simply a complementary piece. I want to reaffirm what WATMO's results through the PHGB Science Committee has shown, that we're still seeing about 0.23 conversion annually across the PHGB. That of course differs within the regions, but that there's no explicit policies that exist currently, and that there is still a limit on the economics research on grassland conservation and ecosystem services. And that regardless of how we move forward, I think this is going to be a difficult issue, not one to avoid, but that you see, agricultural ministries, environment ministries, energy ministries all have quite competing, overlapping goals for these similar landscapes. And so, however we progress, it's going to enhance the body of understanding of these landscapes. Include stakeholders. It's going to be a lot of quite a bit of work, I think, but there's a lot out there that we can build upon. In terms of this work, again, to reiterate some of those return on investment I think we should explore some of those market-based instruments, voluntary market-based instruments that I referenced earlier in the presentation, that depending upon the unique local circumstances, that toolkit can be sort of strategically and precisely applied to conserve grasslands in a way that is acceptable to local communities, and be that agricultural, be that indigenous communities. These are something that I think we should really explore. And however, but currently we are seeing that if you don't have any sort of assessment for those social returns, there's very high incentive to converge, and that continues. So the next steps, I'll just leave it here, are that I think that there needs to be another push for grassland policy development and some sort of proactive communication strategies across organizations. I think that could be valuable. I think there needs to be greater work on stakeholder engagement, particularly some of the human dimensions work to identify ways that you can use some of those hard economic values, but also engage with those social values to work collaboratively with stakeholder groups. And so, and I left the question mark, not because I haven't a clue, I don't have a clue, but that many of you, I am sure, in your professional capacities or personal interests will have excellent ideas of how you can continue, or we can continue forward on this, on this topic. So I just want to acknowledge again, the PhD Policy Committee, the reviewers, and also a friend of mine who provides distant photography. And so I often ask him for permission to use some of these nice prairie photographs. All right, there we have it. You can hit me with questions. Thank you.
All right. Susanna, you can go ahead and ask your question to John if you'd like. John, it's the question she's asking is, if you were to suggest a primary policy statement regarding grassland conservation, what would it be?
Good question, Susanna. I am going to do that political answer to that and just avoid it. I will, I would like that to be something that I would be in discussion with multiple people on this call to come together with something. But I would be maybe a little bit arrogant if I thought I could put that forward today. But thank you. It's a good thing to consider. Sometimes when you sit here staring at your computer screen after speaking for 35 minutes, I hope you all are still there.
Here's your next question. Do any of the prairie provinces have policy for conserving grassland sold on crown lands?
Yeah, I would have to dig back into the table on that. There are, I wouldn't say there's sort of like overarching policy for that, but there are within a lot of the acts that exist and the programs that are being laid out, there are, crown lands are, so you have both public and private. Seems like a nice binary option, but of course within public lands there are many layers, and private lands as well. So there are in some of the provinces there is some work on that. But if you want to email me separately, I can discuss that and share some of my my lists on that with you.
Have you looked at the impact of subsidization of crop insurance on marginal land conversion from grasslands to cropland?
Yeah. Not in terms, I haven't published anything on that, but I have taken more professional interest in it. And I think that is, the way that you can get crop insurance on that and that form of subsidization, I think that is incentive to convert, because you can be insured, you can be taken care of if it's a wet year. And so I think that's one that there needs to be more work on that subject, but I think that's one that often arises that we want to address, I would say, as a grassland conservation community.
All right. I have noted a general belief at the national level that eating beef is bad for the environment. Given the high SROI of beef production on these grasslands, why do you think this is, and what can we do about this misperception?
Yeah, I think that's thanks for, I can't see who's giving these questions, but thank you for that one. I think, that's an issue I've struggled with as over the last 10 years or so. I've both lived in Europe and in Vancouver, and very in highly urban settings, and now we're back on the farm, and many heated discussions I've had around beef consumption, and I think that messaging needs to become clearer. And I think the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Saskatchewan Stock Growers, beef producers, even that the short documentary that was done by Ducks Unlimited and WWF and I think Nature Conservancy recently, it's very good. I think possibly it's just that there is it's a heterogeneous, the beef sector is so heterogeneous too. So you have pasture-fed beef, and then you have more intensive livestock operations. And naturally, those two operations have very different both return on investments, but also impact on the local environment. And so I think some of that is that communication strategy. I think beef has been much maligned, and I think vegetable-based diets, as much as, I don't mind having a Beyond Beef burger once in a while at A&W, though you can eviscerate me for that after if you like. I've already had some family members do that. But I think that there just needs to be a lot of work done to really provide the scientific and social scientific foundations behind those assumptions, and challenge them to think that, if you're eating a soy burger, that does not mean it's, in many cases, it can be worse for the environment. And so the beef sector, though, has really been taking giant strides, I would say, in addressing that misconception. And I think without being, the grain sector is struggling, I would say, to know how to respond similarly. But they're trying, and I think there's really good initiatives in play there. But it's a tough one. So thanks for that question.
In the US, they have a program in the Farm Bill where if a producer breaks native grassland, then you can't access forage or crop insurance for several years. Would this be an approach to take it here in Canada?
I mean, I'd be open to it, I would say. I think that you are starting to see that there is, with some of these voluntary mechanisms that are in place, and there's this sort of the carrot and the stick approach. You don't have to go through regulation and have a blanket policy that says you can't do this, and then you have trouble with enforcement and monitoring, etc. And I think that's what some of the what was happening in some of the states. So this was quite a sort of a mix of approaches that allowed for, you can access some of these things if you're converting. And we're seeing that in a few, even in the grain sector around wetlands, with ICC Plus, if there is monitoring and we're watching up to state that you have not converted anything in the last 5 years, I believe it is. I'm sure there's someone here that I can't remember exactly, but that if you have converted, then you aren't eligible for these payments. And so I think that's a good approach, because it leaves the decision within the private landowner themselves, but there is an option then to incentivize sort of conservation actions. Thank you.
When do you expect these results to be publicly available?
Yeah, so it's under review at the moment, and I would imagine, you know, probably by late summer. I would hope. Sometimes I'd like to have them. Often, you know, though not that many people sometimes read scientific journals. For some of us, that just gets us up in the morning. But I think that it's sort of a useful tool even to say that it has been published. So I would expect, and my hope is this is accepted, probably by late summer or fall. This could be more easily referenced. But there are some parts of it too that I can share as well. So again, if you're interested, I think you all have my email address, so you can contact me directly.
Based on your comments regarding crop insurance, then are incentives to retain grassland more valuable than de-incentivizing through removal of these subsidies?
Can you repeat that question?
Based on your comments regarding crop insurance, then are incentives to retain grasslands more valuable than de-incentivizing through the removal of those subsidies?
Yeah, that's tough too, but I think short answer is yes. I'll leave it at that for right now.
All right, there appears to be no more questions coming in. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with John, I'm sure, or myself, and I can forward them on to him. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have in more detail via email. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank John for his participation in today's PHJV webinar. And we look forward to seeing you all again for our next installment of the PHJV webinar series. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.